Joan Rivers, the legendary comedian, resided in a luxurious penthouse at 1 East 62nd Street in Manhattan for 28 years until her passing in 2014. The residence, designed in a neo-French classical style by architect Horace Trumbauer, was adorned with opulent decor reminiscent of the Palace of Versailles. Rivers often quipped that it was where Marie Antoinette would have lived if she had the money. During her tenure, Rivers reported experiencing paranormal activities in the penthouse. She believed the spirit of Mrs. Spencer, a niece of financier J.P. Morgan and a former resident of the building, haunted the residence. Neighbors also claimed to have seen apparitions dancing in the ballroom and descending the grand staircase in evening attire. To address these disturbances, Rivers enlisted the help of a voodoo priestess to perform a cleansing ceremony, after which the unsettling occurrences reportedly ceased. The penthouse at 1 East 62nd Street remained vacant for several years, its once grand salons shrouded in silence, the gold leaf moldings and chandeliers casting lonely glimmers in the empty halls. Despite its prestige, buyers seemed to hesitate, as if the property carried an unspoken weight, one that could not be measured in dollars. The rumors never truly died. Workers whispered of strange drafts in sealed rooms, of lights flickering on despite the power being off. Then, in early 2025, a new buyer emerged, an enigmatic couple from London, Jonathan and Evelyn Harrow. They were quiet about their wealth, yet their funds cleared effortlessly, allowing them to close the deal within days. The Harrows had made their fortune in antique restoration, curating pieces that bore histories darker than they ever admitted. When asked why they had chosen Joan Rivers' former home, Evelyn only smiled. "The house chose us," she said. From the moment they moved in, things were unsettling. The couple had intended to preserve the opulent French decor, but as renovations began, workers reported disturbing encounters. Tools vanished and reappeared in different rooms. A foreman swore he saw a woman in an elaborate gown standing on the mezzanine, watching. Yet when he looked again, she was gone. The chandelier above the grand staircase swayed gently, though there was no draft. Evelyn, a woman known for her rationality, became withdrawn. She spent long hours in the ballroom, speaking softly to no one. Jonathan found her handwriting in a forgotten guestbook, except it wasn't her usual sharp script. The lines, written in old-fashioned ink, read, "You may redecorate the walls, but the bones of this house are mine." One night, as Jonathan ascended the marble staircase, he heard laughter echoing from the drawing room. Not Evelyn's. A voice older, raspier, edged with amusement. Then the lights flickered, and the grand chandelier let out a groaning creak. And from the darkness, something whispered his name. The penthouse street had always held a presence, a quiet, watchful stillness that crept through its corridors like a patient whisper. It was not the house itself, nor the gold-trimmed mirrors that lined the walls, nor the grand chandeliers that dripped with crystals catching the dim glow of the city. It was something unseen, something lingering just beyond the marble thresholds, in the air thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten laughter. The Harrows did not speak of it, not at first. Jonathan Harrow had always prided himself on his logical mind, his ability to strip a thing down to its most tangible elements. To him, a house was stone, plaster, wood. It did not breathe, it did not listen. But as the weeks passed, he found himself questioning that certainty. The rooms felt aware. The mirrors reflected more than just his image. They seemed to carry an echo of movement, a suggestion of figures just beyond his periphery, vanishing the moment he turned his head. Evelyn changed first. She was drawn to the ballroom, that cavernous space lined with gilded moldings and the heavy drapery Joan Rivers had once adored. The air was different there, thick with something unseen, something Jonathan could not name. At night, he would find her standing by the tall windows, looking out over the city as if listening to a conversation just beyond his hearing. "Did you hear that?" she would murmur, fingers brushing absently over the silk of her dressing gown. He never did, but she did. The workers left one by one. It was never anything obvious, never a scream in the night or the dramatic slamming of doors. They simply refused to return, citing scheduling conflicts, whispering about misplaced tools and rooms that felt different when they stepped inside. One, an older man with deep-lined hands and the weary gaze of someone who had seen too much, had pulled Jonathan aside before vanishing altogether. "She doesn't want us here," he had muttered. "The lady of the house." Jonathan had laughed then, shaking his head. "Joan Rivers? She's dead." But the man had only stared at him, his expression unreadable. Not her. And so the renovation stalled, leaving the house half-finished, half-inhabited. The ballroom remained untouched, as if time itself had recoiled from altering it. It was there, late one evening, that Jonathan found Evelyn not standing by the window this time, but seated at the old piano, her fingers resting lightly against the ivory keys. She did not play. She only sat, motionless, her breath slow and measured. The room was dim, the chandelier above casting a golden haze that flickered oddly, as if uncertain whether to hold steady or tremble. He stepped closer. "Evelyn?" She did not turn. "Darling?" she murmured. And there was something strange in her voice, something old. A shiver crawled down Jonathan's spine. "Evelyn, what are you?" Then she turned her head, just slightly, just enough for him to see the flicker of something in her eyes, something foreign, something borrowed. And then, as if from the depths of the house itself, a whisper curled through the air, thick with amusement, with knowing. "You should have left when you had the chance. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The whisper hung in the air like the last breath of a dying fire, soft, curling at the edges, slipping through the space between reality and something far older, far colder. It wasn't Evelyn's voice. Not entirely. Jonathan felt the weight of it settle over his skin, a sensation like being watched through a keyhole, unseen fingers pressing lightly against the back of his neck. He tried to speak, to say her name again, but his throat felt tight. His voice caught somewhere deep, strangled by a sensation he couldn't name. Evelyn's fingers remained on the keys of the piano, unmoving. The air in the ballroom was thick, expectant. The chandelier above flickered once, just once, but it was enough to cast shadows that stretched unnaturally long, bending over the marble floor in ways that defied the light. Jonathan took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath his weight. The sound swallowed too quickly, as if the house itself had leaned in to listen. Evelyn turned to him then, her face half-lit by the golden glow of the chandelier, her expression unreadable. "I don't think we're alone," she murmured, and there was something in the way she said it, something unsettlingly calm, as if the realization was not a fear, but a fact she had come to accept. Jonathan swallowed. "Evelyn, you're scaring me." Her lips curled, not quite a smile, not quite anything at all. "Am I?" A breath of air moved through the room, though the windows were closed, the heavy curtains drawn. Jonathan's heart pounded harder now, an instinctive rhythm, the way a body reacts to something it does not understand but knows it should fear. Then, from somewhere above them, beyond the mezzanine, a sound. Soft at first, almost delicate. Footsteps. Not the casual rhythm of someone walking through their own home, but something deliberate, measured. The sound of heels against marble, slow, dragging, echoing down the grand staircase as if descending from some place beyond sight. Jonathan turned sharply, staring at the staircase. Nothing. Just the heavy railings, the gilded accents gleaming in the low light. But the sound continued. Step by step. His breath turned shallow. He tried to remind himself of logic, of reason. The house was old. Creaked. Air vents shifted. The mind played tricks. But then the chandelier above them let out a sound. A groan, a slow, shuddering creak, as if the weight of the house had suddenly settled into its bones. Jonathan took Evelyn's wrist. "We need to go." She didn't resist. But as she rose from the piano bench, her fingers lingered on the wood, tracing patterns in the dust that should not have been there. The house had been cleaned, every surface wiped spotless. And yet, Jonathan looked down. The dust beneath her fingertips had already begun to swirl, shifting into shapes, letters. At first, they were nothing, just meaningless smudges. But as he watched, they began to take form, the strokes of each character deliberate, unmistakable. A name. Spencer. His pulse roared in his ears. He knew the name. Of course he did. Mrs. Spencer. The woman Joan Rivers had always said haunted this house. The one the workers had spoken of in hushed voices before they left, never to return. A silence stretched between them, thick as velvet, suffocating. Then, just as Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, the grand chandelier above them gave one final, violent sway. The bulbs flickered once, twice before the entire room plunged into darkness. And somewhere, close enough to feel, close enough to touch, someone laughed. The laughter was not sharp or sudden but slow, dragging through the air like something unraveling, like silk slipping through unseen hands. It did not belong to Evelyn. It did not belong to him. It was something else, something old, something that had been waiting. Jonathan's grip on Evelyn's wrist tightened instinctively. The darkness of the ballroom was thick, almost physical, pressing against them, swallowing the last remnants of the chandelier's dying glow. His breath felt too loud in his own ears. Somewhere in the blackness, the laughter faded, not stopping so much as retreating, sinking back into the marrow of the house like a presence that had merely stepped aside to watch. Then a sound. A slow, deliberate scrape, like fabric against stone, like movement. Jonathan's pulse slammed against his ribs. He had always dismissed the stories, the whispers of hauntings, of unseen figures moving through the grand halls. He had told himself that old houses made noises, that cold drafts and settling wood could explain the strange occurrences. But there was no logic to this. There was no reasonable explanation for the suffocating weight of the dark, for the quiet press of something unseen. He turned sharply, still holding Evelyn's wrist, ready to pull her toward the door, to force their way out if he had to, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring past him. Her eyes, wide and dark, were locked on something in the blackness behind him. "Evelyn," he whispered. She didn't move. He felt it then. The air shifted. The hair on the back of his neck rose, an involuntary reaction to something his body sensed before his mind could comprehend. Presence. Not a figure, not something tangible, but something vast and silent and waiting. His breath hitched. It was behind him. The urge to run surged through him, hot and instinctive, but he could not turn, could not move. The ballroom felt endless, stretching beyond its walls, into something deeper, something hollow and hungry. Then, Evelyn whispered, "She's here." Jonathan forced himself to move, to turn his head, just slightly, just enough to see. A flicker, a shape in the dark. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but something real. A figure, tall and rigid, standing at the base of the grand staircase, its presence just barely illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the heavy drapes. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her silhouette sharp against the darkness, unmoving, watching. The silence deepened. The air in the room pressed inward, thick with something unseen, something expectant. The chandeliers above them swayed ever so slightly, their crystals chiming together like distant bells. And then, the woman moved, not in a normal way, not with the casual grace of a living being, but with something unnatural, something wrong, a slow, gliding step, as if the marble beneath her was not quite solid, as if she were slipping through something unseen. Jonathan took a step back. His foot scraped against the floor, and the sound, a single, small noise, seemed impossibly loud in the cavernous stillness. The woman stopped. The air around them grew colder. Evelyn's breath hitched, her fingers tightening against his. She was shaking. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, to demand, to plead, but before he could form a word, the woman lifted her hand. A slow, deliberate gesture, not toward Evelyn, not toward the house, toward him, and from the silence came a voice, low, ancient, amused. "You don't belong here." The chandeliers above them shattered. The crash of the chandeliers was not just sound, it was sensation, a rippling shockwave that rattled the very bones of the house. Glass and crystal rained down in a shimmering storm, catching the dim light in fractured bursts as they shattered against the marble floor. The air filled with the high, sharp notes of breaking, the sound of 1,000 delicate things dying at once. Jonathan flinched, instinctively raising an arm to shield his face, but he never felt the glass hit him. The shards fell around them, scattering at their feet, yet none touched his skin. They landed in neat, impossible patterns, as though something had willed them to avoid him. A breath soft, deliberate curled past his ear. Not Evelyn's. He turned, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Just the cavernous dark of the ballroom, the glittering wreckage on the floor, and Evelyn, standing deathly still. She was staring, not at him, not at the destruction, at the woman. The figure at the foot of the staircase remained perfectly poised, untouched by the chaos. The glow from the streetlights barely reached her, but Jonathan could see her more clearly now. The heavy gown, layers of lace and silk impossibly crisp, untouched by dust, as if she had stepped through time itself. Her hair, an elaborate sweep of soft curls piled high, strands tumbling loose in a way that was too perfect, too preserved. Her skin, impossibly smooth, a pale that seemed almost luminous, like candle wax that had never melted. And her eyes, dark, endless, not empty, no full of something ancient, something knowing, something that had been watching long before they ever stepped foot in this house. She had not moved since she raised her hand toward him, had not spoken beyond that first whispered warning, and yet the air still crackled with presence, with the weight of unseen things shifting just beyond the reach of sight. Evelyn exhaled, a trembling breath that sounded almost like a sob. "She sees you now," she whispered. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, the woman moved, not with footsteps, not with the weight of a living thing pressing against the floor. She drifted, a slow, gliding shift forward, as if the marble beneath her offered no resistance. Jonathan's body screamed at him to run, to turn, to move, but he couldn't. His feet were rooted, the muscles in his legs locked in place, his breath shallow and short. The woman wasn't stopping. Closer. Evelyn gasped. Jonathan felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air, the sudden, pressing cold wrapping around his ribs, clawing at his skin. The dim light from the ruined chandeliers flickered wildly, throwing long, distorted shadows across the walls. And then, she was in front of him. No space left between them, no barrier of air or logic or distance. He saw her face, clear now, too clear, flawless, porcelain pale, but wrong, unmoving, too smooth, as if it had never known expression, never known time. And then, at last, she smiled. Not a warm smile, not a human smile, something else, something that knew exactly who he was. A hand delicate, gloved in lace, rose toward his throat. And then, everything went black. The darkness was not empty. It was thick, suffocating, alive. Jonathan felt it close around him, pressing against his skin like something tangible, something with weight. His breath caught in his throat, his body locked in place as if the very air had turned to stone. He was nowhere, no longer in the ballroom, no longer in the house, but in a space that had no shape, no edges, no light. He could not see Evelyn, could not hear the city beyond the walls, could not move. And then, a voice, soft, almost tender. "Do you know what happens to those who refuse to listen?" The cold around him deepened, wrapping around his ribs like fingers pressing inward. A flicker, just a sliver of movement in the black, a suggestion of something shifting. Then a touch, cold, delicate, resting lightly against his throat. A hand, her hand. His breath came in ragged bursts now, every instinct screaming, every nerve in his body locked in place as he felt the lace-covered fingers brush against his skin, ghosting along the line of his jaw, his pulse hammering beneath them. Her voice closer now, too close. "You walked into my house," she murmured, "and thought it belonged to you." Jonathan's chest constricted. The hand against his throat tightened. Not enough to choke him. Not yet, but enough to warn. The blackness shifted. No, not blackness. Not anymore. Shapes began to emerge, slow and insidious, like ink bleeding through fabric. Walls, ceilings, towering drapery too old, its velvet rotting at the edges. A grand staircase, its banister warped, twisted into something almost organic, something that breathed. And at the top of the staircase, figures, still, watching, dozens of them, not alive, not dead, suspended, frozen in time, their faces blurred, their bodies draped in gowns and suits that did not belong to this century. Jonathan tried to take a step back. He couldn't. The hand at his throat held him in place. The woman, Mrs. Spencer, tilted her head. Her eyes were dark wells, endless and knowing. She smiled again. Would you like to know what happened to the last man who stood where you are? A sharp, wet sound filled the space. A tearing, a crack, a gasp cut short, and then the figure at the top of the stairs shifted. Not moved, fell. A sudden, violent drop as if yanked by unseen hands, tumbling forward, down the warped steps, limbs twisting at impossible angles, body flung like a broken marionette. Jonathan barely had time to react before the body hit the floor with a sickening crunch. His stomach lurched. The figure was motionless, crumpled at unnatural angles, its head twisted too far to one side, the mouth slightly open as if in the middle of a final, unfinished word. And then, the head turned. Not by gravity, not by accident, by will. A pair of dead, glassy eyes locked onto him. Jonathan tried to scream, but Mrs. Spencer's fingers tightened, and suddenly he was falling, spiraling. The house unraveled around him, warping, pulling away, as if the walls themselves had decided to let go, to spit him out. Cold air roared past his ears, a rush of unseen corridors, of doors slamming open and closed, of whispers that bled together, voices rising in laughter and sobs and something in between. And then, light, blinding, violent, he hit the floor. Marble, cold, solid, real. The ballroom. He was back. His chest heaved, lungs dragging in ragged, desperate gulps of air. The chandelier, whole again, swayed gently above him. The grand staircase loomed, unchanged, pristine. The piano sat untouched, the dust still resting in perfect, undisturbed layers. And Evelyn, she stood a few feet away watching him, silent, still. But something was wrong. Jonathan pushed himself upright, his limbs trembling. Evelyn, he choked out. She didn't answer, didn't blink, didn't breathe. A cold wave of horror slithered through him. She was too still, too perfect, like a portrait, like a figure behind glass, like the ones in the hallway. No, Jonathan whispered. His pulse slammed in his ears. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for her, his hands grasping at her arms, her shoulders. Cold. Wrong. Her skin wasn't skin. It was smooth, unyielding, like porcelain. His breath caught. Evelyn's lips parted, slowly, deliberately, and in a voice that wasn't hers, that was layered, distant, something echoing from a place far beyond this world. She whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." The doors of the house slammed shut, and the laughter began again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.